roll a fully loaded cargo ship out of the water, set it up on blocks in a dry dock, and you finally see the half of it the ocean keeps hidden. Below the line the waves normally reach, the steel turns a deep rust red, one unbroken band of color running the length of a hull longer than a city block. Nearly every large ship afloat wears it. Cross any ocean, dock in any country, and the part of the ship no one ever sees is painted the same red. The usual explanation is that it's just tradition. Old paint happened to be red, the habit stuck, and now red is simply what the bottom of a ship looks like. That's true as far as it goes. But the maritime engineers, the marine biologists, and the people who write international shipping law will tell you the red marks the edge of something far stranger than a habit. It's the visible front of a chemical war that has run with no real pause for more than 250 years. A war so effective that it once started to poison the sea itself and quietly forced the entire world to rewrite the rules. The enemy in that war is alive, and one of its oldest soldiers looks like a worm. Sailors called it the shipworm. It is actually a mollusk, a soft, pale, reddish-gray animal that can grow as long as your arm, and it does one thing with terrible patience. It bores into submerged wood and eats it from the inside, drilling long tunnels through a ship's timbers until only a thin shell of sound wood remains and the hull begins to fail. For most of seafaring history, this was a death sentence with a delay built in. A vessel could leave port looking perfect and come apart at sea months later, hollowed out below the waterline by an animal the crew never saw. These creatures were not picky about ships either. In 1731, the Dutch coast flooded after shipworm weakened the wooden facings on the dikes so badly that they collapsed. Christopher Columbus is thought to have carried the worst of them back to Europe in the hulls of his returning ships. For 2 centuries, the world's navies had no real answer. They scraped, they burned, they coated hulls in tar and horsehair, and the worm kept eating. The answer arrived in 1761, in the form of a single experiment. The Royal Navy took a frigate called HMS Alarm and nailed thin sheets of copper across her entire bottom. The result was almost unreasonable. The worms stopped. The weed and barnacles that normally dragged on a hull stopped too, because seawater reacts with copper to leave a faint, slightly poisonous film across the surface, and almost nothing living can take hold on it. A coppered ship was protected, and it was faster. The advantage was so clear that between 1779 and 1781, the Navy sheathed its whole fleet in copper, and for a while, British warships could simply outrun and outlast everyone else's. That era left a phrase still used today: when people call a sure thing a copper-bottomed guarantee. The promise underneath the metal was real, but copper sheets and steel hulls do not get along. When iron and then steel ships replaced wooden ones in the 19th century, you could no longer just nail copper to the bottom, because copper pressed against iron in seawater sets off a slow electrical corrosion that eats the cheaper metal alive. So the copper moved off the hull and into the paint. Ground into a pigment called cuprous oxide, copper could be brushed straight onto a steel bottom, slowly releasing the same trace poison that had stopped the worm for the Royal Navy. And cuprous oxide has a color of its own. It is a deep red-brown. To this day, somewhere around 90% of the world's ships are protected by copper-based paint, and the red you see in the dry dock is, in large part, simply the color of the copper doing its work. The tradition is real. Underneath it sits the chemistry that made the tradition. Anyone who has ever owned a small boat knows this paint by hand. Through the 1980s and 1990s, the spring ritual of hauling the boat out and rolling on a fresh coat of thick, bright red bottom paint with that sharp metallic smell was the same 200-year-old trick shrunk down to a backyard and a paint roller. For a long time, copper was the best anyone had. Then, in the middle of the 20th century, chemists found something that worked even better, and that turned out to be the problem. The new compound was called tributyltin, or TBT. As a hull coating, it was close to perfect, far deadlier to barnacles and weed than copper, lasting longer between repaints, and the shipping world adopted it fast. The trouble showed up first not on the ships, but in the oyster beds of Arcachon Bay, on the Atlantic coast of France. Starting in the late 1970s, the bay's oyster farmers watched their harvest collapse. The oysters stopped reproducing. The ones that survived grew strange, thick, curled shells and became worthless. For a few years running, the farmers pulled in almost nothing, and an industry that had worked the bay for generations was staring at ruin. Scientists tracing the cause kept arriving at the same source: the TBT leaching off the painted hulls of the thousands of pleasure boats moored in the same water. Then came the detail that turned a fishing problem into an international alarm. Marine biologists studying the small sea snail called the dog whelk found that near busy harbors, the females were growing male sexual organs and turning sterile, and whole local populations were simply disappearing. Researchers gave the condition a name, Imposex, and the cause was the same trace of TBT washing off the bottoms of boats. A paint sold as a clean efficiency upgrade was, very quietly, sterilizing the life around every marina that used it. France acted first. In January 1982, the French government banned TBT, paint on boats under 25 meters, an early and unusually fast use of what we'd now call the precautionary principle. Act on the harm before every last question is settled. The rest of the world followed across the decade that the modal viewer of this channel lived right through. Britain banned it in 1987, the United States in 1988, Australia in 1989, and then, in a treaty adopted in 2001 and brought into force in 2008, the International Maritime Organization, the United Nations body that writes the rules for global shipping, banned TBT outright on the hulls of ships worldwide. The sea answered the way you'd hope. As TBT levels fell, the dog whelks came back, the oysters recovered, and the deformed shells stopped appearing. The worst chapter of the chemical war ended not in disaster, but in a fix that mostly worked. And the red? The red went back to copper. The 18th century answer, the tamer one, the one the Royal Navy stumbled onto with a single frigate, is once again the one painted onto most of the ships at sea. It stayed red because copper stayed, and copper stayed because the worm and the barnacle never left. None of which explains why anyone bothers fighting that war at all, until you look at the cost of losing it. A hull left to foul does not just look bad. According to a study published by the International Maritime Organization, even a light layer of barnacles can raise the fuel use and emissions of an average container ship by as much as 55%, and a film of slime no thicker than a coat of paint, covering half the hull, can add a fifth on its own. Multiply that across the tens of thousands of ships moving the world's goods at any moment, and the red band on the bottom of each one is one of the largest fuel-saving measures on the planet that almost no one ever thinks about. There is a second job, too. A fouled hull is a moving reef. Barnacles, weed, and mussels picked up in one ocean ride across the world and drop off in another. And that is one of the main ways invasive species cross seas they could never have reached on their own. The red paint keeps the hull clean enough to burn less fuel, and clean enough not to smuggle a Pacific mussel into the Mediterranean. Plain, unglamorous, and doing an enormous amount of hidden work. So the next time you're standing at a harbor and a great empty ship rides high in the water, look at the band of red showing above the surface, the part that's normally underwater and out of sight. That color is the most honest thing on the ship. It's a quarter-millennium-old truce with the ocean, written in copper, fought over by oyster farmers and chemists and the people who write the law of the sea, and still being negotiated every time a ship is hauled out and painted again. The official story is that it's tradition. The truer story is everything the tradition is standing on, which leaves one last question, and it points the other way. If a wooden ship's bottom rots and bores away in a few years without that protection, then how does a wooden warship sometimes sink, sit on the seabed for 300 years, and come back up almost whole, while another vanishes into nothing in a decade? The answer is about where the water is cold, where the worm can't live, and what the mud does to a wreck it swallows. That's the next one we'll pull up. If you want to come along, subscribe, and we'll meet you on the seabed.